We just published an article at Stronger by Science. On the show, when we publish a new article, we often have a little discussion about it. So, Greg, why don't you tell us about the new article?
Yeah, sure. So the title of this article is The Most Commonly Neglected Movements and Muscles, parentheses, and Exercises to Address Weak Links, close parentheses. This is a guest article by Cameron Gill, who has written 2 or 3 other really good guest articles for Stronger by Science before. Big fan of his content. And so this one I found very interesting. I think this is my personal favorite of his articles he's written for the site so far. And so, it's basically like a survey of what muscles are trained quite well, like what muscles or muscle groups are trained quite well by the big exercises people commonly do in the gym. So pressing exercises, upper body pulling exercises, hip hinge style lower body exercises, squat style lower body exercises, and then what muscles are neglected by those movements, which, might benefit from a little love. And so he identified 3 kind of broad categories of muscles that tend to be pretty neglected by those big exercises that most people focus on. And that would be scapular muscles that participate in scapular protraction. So, most things we're retracting our scapula. So, scapular protractors, primarily the pec minor and the serratus anterior, might be getting neglected. The hip flexor group as a whole might be getting neglected. So, unless you're doing a bunch of leg raises, maybe you're doing leg raises for the purpose of ab training, but you're also primarily training your hip flexors. If you're not doing any of that, your hip flexors probably aren't getting enough love, and also your hip abductor group. And so I found this article really interesting because one of the things Cameron did is basically try to quantify how much muscle mass are we neglecting by not training these muscles. And so, coming right out of the gate, your scapular protractors, on the whole, take up more total muscle volume than your lats do. And that's primarily from your serratus anterior, which I was surprised to learn is a very large muscle group. I did not know your serratus anterior was that large, but like in untrained folks, their serratus anterior is like 90% the total muscle volume of their lats. And, we tend to not train the serratus that hard. Similar with the hip flexors, overall, the total volume of the hip flexors group is about 12% greater than that of the gluteus maximus, which I think is the largest muscle in the body. So, if you're not training your hip flexors, that is a lot of muscle mass that's being neglected. It makes the case for why you should probably want to train those muscles, how much of your total muscle mass you're neglecting if you aren't, and then, a bunch of exercises that you can use to target those muscles. It's a really good article. You should check it out. One question that's already come up after sharing this is someone basically asked, like, if I care mostly about my physique, like, why should I care about this? Like, what visual difference will it make if I'm training my scapular protractors, if I'm training my hip flexors, etc.? And I think that I think that for the most part, you're dealing with deep muscles. So I think it's helpful to think of it the same way you might think of like brachialis training. So, you don't really see your brachialis. If it gets bigger, you're not going to look at someone and be like, dude, you have sick brachialis development. But since it lies deep to the bicep, when your brachialis gets thicker, it pushes your bicep further from your humerus. And so, the top of your bicep peak is then further from the rest of your arm. And so your whole arm just looks bigger and more developed. And I think that's the case for most of these muscles. Like, if your hip flexors get bigger, most of them are on the anterior portion of your thigh. They tend to, they're either deep to or in the same general area as your quads. So, better developed hip flexors will probably just, someone who doesn't know anatomy super well, if you have really developed hip flexors, they'll probably be like, dude, you have huge quads. Or like your pec minor. It lies deep to your pecs, kind of on the upper and outer part of your chest. So, it'll just look like slightly better upper chest development if you develop your pec minor. So I think those are the sorts of visual differences you can anticipate. But yeah, there's a lot of muscle in your body that you probably aren't training quite as hard as the rest of your muscle. So might make sense to show those muscle groups a bit of love.